So my name is David Germano, and I'll introduce our speaker today on behalf of the Environmental Humanities, the Environmental Resilience Institute, and the Contemplative Science Center, the three co-sponsors of the talk today. And I'm going to mercifully keep my remarks short, so don't worry, but I think one of the marks or one of the inspiring aspects of our speaker today is that I actually have a lot of thoughts. You know, usually when I'm giving an introduction, I'm typically thinking about how to talk about the person in question, but today I'm really thinking about all the different thoughts that have come out of the first time I met Mark in the past and the meeting we just had over the last hour or so. And so I just want to share a few thoughts that are completely inspired by these dialogues with Mark and what he's been doing with the Nature Conservancy, which I'll talk about in a moment. The first thing is just about resiliency. We have three co-sponsoring organizations, one focused on environmental science, one focused on the humanities, and one focused on contemplation. And I think what binds us all together, in a sense, is our common interest in the topic of resiliency. Resiliency in the sense of navigating change, the change that we face in terms of our environment, in terms of our communities, in terms of our individual life. How do we go about contemplating change, the change that happens within us, the change that happens without us, the change that happens whether we want it or not, and the change that we hope to trigger in the world around us? And so as we contemplate change, we come to terms with the complexity of how all these different pieces, different people, different forms of life, the natural environment are bound together, and the extraordinary kind of exponential complexity that burdens us when we try to think about how we can have intentional agency in this world. And when we think about change and think about our capacity to navigate change, it really comes down to practices. The practices that we do that cause negative change in the world, and the practices that we might do that might trigger positive change in the world. And with this in mind, our speaker will be discussing mindfulness amongst other kinds of practices. Mindfulness has sometimes been defined as a practice that's a distinctive combination of intention and attention and attitude, namely intentionally, deliberately, with a goal in mind, taking our awareness, training our awareness, our attention, and bringing it to a subject matter that we care about, perhaps natural processes, perhaps our emotions, perhaps our relationships with another. And there's an attitude, there's a particular way that we bring our attention with that intention to the subject in question. And that particular way is with openness, with a relaxation of biases, with a focus on the present moment. It's all its contextual complexity. And so I can't think of a better person today than to talk about these subjects in terms of the intersection of the change that's happening in our environment and the change we hope to see in the environment and the change that happens within all of us each and every day. And so Mark Tercek will be talking today about slowing the mind to speed up progress. Mark, as I'm sure all of you know, is the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, the largest nonprofit environmental organization in the world, 4,000 staff, 2 million members, 800 million operating budget, 72 countries. It's as ubiquitous as the world itself. And before joining the Nature Conservancy, Mark was a partner and managing director in Goldman Sachs, where he worked for 24 years. And also in 2005, he led the firm's environmental strategy and environmental markets group. And so Mark is a champion, and this is articulated in his best-selling book, Nature's Fortune, How Business and Society Thrive by Investing in Nature. He's a champion of the idea of natural capital, of valuing nature for its own sake, but also for the services it provides for the people who are embedded within it, such as clean air, water, productive soils, and a stable climate. And I think the thing that I most admire Mark for, despite all of his achievements, is that he has this seemingly trajectory, or he's drawn towards implausible convergences. He's made an entire career in terms of leading the Nature Conservancy at bringing together business and conservation, bringing together different partners that initially seem at odds with each other. And it feels like he's really drawn towards that, drawn towards seeing possibilities where other people see polarization. And I think that kind of building bridge theme is also manifest in the topic of today's talk, namely thinking about the world outside of ourselves and the world inside of ourselves, the environmental and natural world and the kind of human and social world, and thinking about, I think in very compelling ways, about the way in which the change that we want to trigger in the world outside us has to be accompanied by an intentional, deliberate attention to the kinds of changes that are happening within us. And so please join me in welcoming Mark Tercek today to speak with us.
Thank you, David, for that nice introduction, and thanks, everybody, for showing up. It's an honor to be here. I get to give a fair number of talks on environmental topics, and I'm pretty confident about doing so. But it's very rare when I'm invited to speak about topics like contemplation and mindfulness. But I'm going to do that today, and I'm really pleased to do that too. In fact, the occasion of this speech required me to do some hard thinking about that, and it's been really good for me. So today I'm going to talk about slowing down the mind. That's the contemplative and mindfulness part, to accelerate social progress. In my case, I'll use the example of environmental progress. So on the first topic, I'm really no expert on mindfulness. Many people here know much more than me. All I really know is my humble personal experience. So I'm going to talk about myself a bit more probably than is polite, but that's the way I'll tell that part of the story. So you'll know where I'm coming from. But then I'll pivot to how we can make environmental progress, and there I have a lot to talk about. And in that capacity, I'll be speaking on behalf of the Nature Conservancy. The mindfulness stuff is more just me. But anyway, thank you very much for being here. So let me start with the mindfulness part. And to do so, I think I have to tell you a little bit about me so you know where I'm coming from. But I'll try to be quick. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in kind of a working-class neighborhood, kid of immigrants from Slovenia. And I had, I think, a pretty conventional childhood and days in school. I had some lucky breaks, though, so I got to go to good schools. From there, I pursued a career on Wall Street, as you heard, got married, had some kids. And it really wasn't until pretty late in my life and my wife's life. We were both kind of city kids and remained city people. But as parents, we made a real effort to introduce our kids to the outdoors. And one thing led to another, and lo and behold, we became environmentalists, which I think is good for we environmentalists, because one conclusion I have from that story is there's an inner environmentalist in almost everybody. We just have to unlock that environmentalist, find it. And then as a business person, I was always one of those business people who believed, and I still believe, that business can be a force for good. So those two kind of interests of mine came together. I came up with this idea that I wanted to be an environmentalist. It wasn't a very good or well-developed idea. Finally, I decided I would just quit Goldman Sachs, where I was a partner. Almost no one did this. Almost all of my colleagues said, "Good luck, Mark. Don't let the door hit you on the way out." Eager to grab my clients. Thank goodness my boss at the time was Hank Paulson, smarter guy than me in general and knew a lot more about the environment than me. And when he heard about my plan, he said, that doesn't sound like a very well-developed plan, Mark. Indeed, it wasn't. And then he said, I have a better idea. Don't leave Goldman Sachs. Instead, build for Goldman Sachs an environmental effort. Today, this is very commonplace. All great financial institutions have an environmental effort. But this was back in late 2005. Then it was actually kind of a radical, weird idea. But I didn't have a much better idea, so I went for it. Hank then left and went to Treasury. But the core idea of my little environmental effort at Goldman Sachs was make the case first for Goldman and then for its clients that there was a kind of a Venn diagram where you could find ample opportunities to do things that would strengthen your business and also strengthen environmental outcomes. The more we looked for these opportunities, the more we found. So that's kind of how I became an environmentalist, in short. Then one day a headhunter called me up because I was, I had become somewhat well known in the environmental world as this banker guy doing environmental stuff. So the search firm called me to see if I had any suggestions for the new search this firm was running for the head of TNC. The search firm definitely did not have in mind me. I don't think anyone had in mind somebody like me. But hearing about the Nature Conservancy job, I said, yeah, if you don't mind, I do have a suggestion. I nominated myself. They really had no choice but to at least interview me. And then one thing you learn at a firm like Goldman Sachs is if there's something you want, like a piece of business, we were really trained then to pull out all the stops in pursuit of that. So I'm pretty sure I was the best prepared of the diverse set of candidates to be the next CEO of TNC, and lo and behold, I got the job. So that's how I got to the Nature Conservancy. And I was intensely excited, At one point in that process, it looked like I wasn't going to get the job. And my dear wife, Amy, said, "Oh, don't worry, dear. If you don't get this, NGO job, you can work for some other environmental NGO." But this is before I was working at TNC. I said, "I know, but there's only one TNC." So let me tell you a little bit about the TNC, what I perceived TNC to be before I joined. I can just jump ahead to today. Today, TNC, I guess you heard from David, we're big. Big's not everything. There are many great small environmental NGOs that we really admire, I really admire. We need them. But big is something. At TNC, we try to specialize in big things, and the world needs big things. We're big. We're kind of deal-oriented. We always were. That appealed to the investment banker in me. We're nonpartisan. We have a knack for bringing people together. That appealed to me. And we're very much science-based. It's a murky, complicated world we work in, so we really like to base our strategies and everything we do in the best science. Oh, and we're global, as you heard. All of that sort of reminded me of my world at Goldman Sachs. So that's what made me excited about coming to TNC as an outsider, and I was right about what I perceived. When I joined, it was mid-July 2008. So I got started. I think people were scratching their heads among our ranks. What's this guy from Wall Street doing here? And then, lo and behold, the financial crisis really heated up. So right after I joined, Lehman Brothers went bust, AIG went bust, and TNC, although we're 70 years old today, we've mostly been a very prudently managed organization, and I strongly believe we are today. We had gotten out a little bit ahead of our skis. My predecessor did, for good reasons. He had an ambitious global vision, but we weren't so well positioned for the financial downturn, which of course was a big threat to our financial strength. We had a number of vacancies in the leadership team. So I show up, all these firms are going bust right and left, the stock market's in a crisis, and so then one of the first things the team and I had to do was organize a restructuring. It was an ambitious one. We downsized by 25%, although I should add, after downsizing, we quickly regrew to be bigger than we were before that downsizing because we had doubled down on our strengths. But I would just say, as a newcomer, new to NGOs, new to TNC, dealing with the financial crisis, I was under a lot of stress. I think, with the benefit of hindsight, I would say I did a pretty good job as CEO. I didn't do anything by myself. I had a great team, a great board, etc. But I was sort of stressed out, and I was at least self-aware enough to note that I was adding to the overall stress. The way I was doing business, not only was I stressed, I was stressing others out. And I didn't feel very good about that part of the job. I had always thought of myself at Goldman Sachs as a calm, kind of leader. So one of my friends, Marshall Goldsmith, who I used to use as a consultant at Goldman Sachs, he said, "You need a coach," and he offered to coach me pro bono. And as these executive coaches do, he talked to all the people who directly reported to me. He talked to my board, and then he came back to share with me what he learned. And he said, "Well, Mark, you're doing some things well, good for you, but mostly you're being a jerk." And then he told me all about these mistakes I was making, and I felt bad about that, and I was eager to improve, and then he and I came up with this plan to pick a couple of areas where I should seek to improve, and they were, I'll never really forget, but they were to try to be more positive, to listen better, to not sweat the small stuff. Those were the main things I was being asked to do. So, and then, by the way Marshall coaches, he's a clever guy. I was required by Marshall then to go back and meet one-on-one with all the people he interviewed, my board members and the team that reported to me, to share with them my plan for self-improvement, which is kind of humbling, but good, a good exercise. But what I learned right away, I'm almost done with this part of the story. What I learned is, even though I sincerely wanted to improve in these areas, it's not as easy as it looks. And so I made a little bit of improvement, but not as much as I wanted to. And then I don't even really remember why and how this happened, but I began to meditate. I was always kind of interested. I was way into yoga, and I had read a lot about meditating. But that's kind of weird. That's like reading about working out. Reading about working out does not get you in shape, and reading about meditating doesn't make you a calmer or better person. Anyway, I started meditating, I was a beginner. I didn't really know what I was doing. And by the way, I'm not much better than that now. I'm not here as a meditating or mindfulness expert by any means. But as soon as I got started, it dawned on me this was really helping me improve in the ways that Marshall and I wanted to improve. It also was helping me at home with my kids, made me a better husband. It was just a kind of a win-win thing for me. So I was into it, and I even began to talk about it a little bit because my colleagues kept telling me, Mark, everybody's a little afraid of you. You've got to open up more. And so that's how it became known that I was a meditator, although a beginner. And for me personally, it was a really positive experience. And I would say the ways in which meditation has helped me, it's a complicated field, meditation, and there's so many aspects to it. The way it's helped me is it has helped me be less reactive, calmer, quieter, better listener, more respectful to other people, kinder, I hope, compassionate, I hope. These are the kinds of attributes I associate with my own meditation practice. Now, if my kids were here, they'd say, Dad, still plenty of room for improvement. Of course, but some improvement has been underway. So that's how I became a meditator, and that's kind of part one of my story. I'm happy. We'll have time in Q&A. We can talk about any of that. But that's not really my area of expertise. But then, as a person meditating and thinking about this, and then thinking really hard about my full-time duty, which was to lead TNC, which of course means especially thinking hard about what strategies we would or wouldn't choose to use to really scale up and accelerate progress. That's my job. I started to think about, the attributes or characteristics that, in my view at least, have been associated with TNC's biggest past successes have been the same kinds of things that, for me at least, came out of my mindfulness practice. Or when I looked ahead, when you look ahead in the environmental field, our challenges look very, very daunting. We argue, even in peer-reviewed science journal papers, that it's doable. You can do what we seek to do, but we're under no illusion that it will be easy. And so when I think about what's made us successful in the past, or what might allow us to be most successful in the future, I think it's those practices or those behaviors that remind me of what I got out of mindfulness. That's why I want to argue today, as that title showed, slowing down the mind can speed up progress, I think, in the whole social sector, but we'll use as our example the environmental sector. So let me give you a couple of examples, and you can tell me if they make sense or help you understand what I'm talking about. First, a personal observation about the history of TNC. This is not the way TNC normally talks about itself. But it's kind of interesting if you step back and think about all of the organizations in the environmental field. There are many great NGOs, and we have different strategies. Some are campaigners on the left. Others are kind of wonky science groups. Some are locally oriented. Some are big like us and more centrist and inclusive. There are a variety of NGOs in our field, and most of the prominent ones I know very well, and they're all very, very good. But we're a little bit one of a kind at TNC. For example, we really, truly are nonpartisan. Others are aspiring to be nonpartisan, but we simply are. We have, in America, if you look at the roster of our trustees or board or our historic board leaders, there's always been as many Republicans and Democrats, rural, urban, blue state, red state, diverse and nonpartisan. It's always been a big part of who we are. We've always been great at bringing together kind of strange bedfellows. What did you call them, David? Unlikely allies or something? Implausible allies. Now, in hindsight, our implausible allies, they don't look implausible anymore. I'll talk about it, but that's how they looked at the time. We've got like a big balance sheet. We almost look like a company. So what made us that way, and what lessons might the social sector take away from this? Well, when we began, we didn't really seek to be an environmental organization. We were a U.S. land trust. All we wanted to do, I kind of miss the simplicity of this model, all we wanted to do was lock up and protect unspoiled nature before it was spoiled. That was it. Now, the people we hired looked like other organizations' people. I bet on average more left-leaning, lots of wonky scientists, tree huggers. We looked like environmentalists, but our job was protect land in the U.S. So if that's your job, then like a laser, people were focused and went and did that. How do you do that? So if you look at the history of our deals, a lot of what we did, again, this is not the way we normally talk about it. It looks like NIMBYism, not in my backyard. We would persuade rich people to buy up unspoiled land before it was spoiled so that their local community would benefit. Not an especially noble thing. You could say, net, probably a good thing, but not that noble. That's how we started, and that's why we brought together such diverse people. But then the alchemy kind of begins. So think about people trying to do that. You would be respectful. You wouldn't be hung up on anyone's political party or ideology. You just try to bring people together, the more the merrier, to get stuff done. But then you would get to know one another and become friends. This hardly ever happens anymore in society. Red state people, blue state people, diverse people getting on the same side. But if you start off in the right way, that can happen. So we had then this group of staff, volunteers, donors, who might have been initially attracted to TNC just to do some land deals. But as our work broadened and became more diverse, became more focused in the area in developing countries to help vulnerable people, those folks who might never have been wooed aboard, if those had been the initial goals, since they knew us and trusted us, they were happy to join forces. So I think the takeaway from the history of TNC is keep that in mind. Don't only talk with people who agree with you. Don't get too hung up preliminarily on ideological divides and that kind of thing. Just try to make room for as many people, as much a diversity of viewpoint as possible. That's a good formula to get things done. That's Exhibit A, if you will. Exhibit B. Early in my days at TNC, so now about 10 years ago, I had to go to Montana because we've done some stupendous deals in Montana. TNC has invested almost $1 billion of money we've gone out and raised in protecting land in Montana. We're really proud we did that. I think that's a series of transactions that our grandchildren and their grandchildren will thank us for. You should all go visit Montana if you haven't, and we're really proud of what we've done there. Anyway, I'm out there once at a dude ranch that we happened to have picked up somewhere along the line, and this cowboy comes in to have dinner with me, and he walks like a cowboy. He spent his whole life on a horse, and he shares, and he's our local chapter chair at the time. And he shares with me that when we opened our office in Montana, now that would probably be 25, 30 years ago, it was at this very dude ranch. It was our first office. And down the road, we hung up a little sign, the Nature Conservancy. And this guy, Dusty, told me when he and his buddies used to drive by it, they would shoot at it. A little practice. But also a way to let us know how welcome TNC was by the local ranching community. They didn't know us, and we didn't really know them. And back then, working with the ranching industry, or ranchers, was viewed as anathema, as some people think it is for us to work with big oil today. But then something happened. Dusty's and his peers' parents began to pass away. They had become old. And the estate taxes arose. And estate taxes are, the way our tax law works is not, the tax law is indifferent to what you plan to do with the property. So a property in Montana would have one value for ranching purposes, but if you were to instead sell the land to developers, subdivide, and develop that land, it would have a much higher value. So these ranchers like Dusty would owe that kind of tax bill, a tax bill they could never pay as ranchers. So they were all nervous about ranch land being developed. We were too. And that led to our first set of activities in Montana. We raised funds from donors to buy conservation easements from these ranchers, and that is a big reason why all those ranches are intact in Montana today. And those ranchers, who were viewed a little bit skeptically by left-leaning, especially environmentalists back then, or kind of ideological environmentalists, they've proven to be great partners for conservation. And those ranchers who viewed us with some skepticism, enough to shoot at our sign, they're dear friends, such that Dusty rose to be the chapter of our chair. But that's what I mean by building strange alliances. And how do you do that? It's by getting to know people, listening to them, building trust, doing things together. Another example. This happened just before I joined TNC, so I had nothing to do with this. But now we're in Central California on the coast, Morro Bay. So here you have a situation where people have been fishing for generations. They want to continue, they say, to fish for generations. But the fishing technique they've determined is most profitable is bottom trawling. So that's dragging a trawler along the seabed. Our scientists tell us that much more trawler dragging by these fishermen means there won't be any fishing going on soon in this generation, let alone future generations. So we team up with EDF. I don't mean to knock EDF here. They're quite close partners to us. But EDF and TNC show up, and we try to talk the fishing community into changing its practices. And we do that the old-fashioned way. We harangue them. I'll move back. Anyway, as you might imagine, the haranguing doesn't go very well. The fishers kind of think they're suspicious of us, number one. We're outsiders, number two. And we're haranguing them. We're hassling them. We're telling them the way they do business is no good. We don't get along. There's no listening. There's no getting to know you. And so the thing goes nowhere. And so the project comes to a halt. EDF goes home. TNC almost goes home. But a few individuals are unwilling to give up. And so then in kind of classic TNC fashion, they scrape together some money. And lo and behold, what do? We buy a few vessels and a few fishing licenses, and TNC enters the fishing community. Now the fishing community really freaks out because these weird tree huggers are part of the business. But then we get to work. We're against trawlers, of course, right? So we introduce, deep line fishing. I think that's what it's called. I'm not a fisher, but you guys might know. Anyway, we're using lines to bring up fish. Because we're bringing the fish up live and healthy, we can sell them into the now booming local sushi market. We get much better economics doing that. We don't want to stay in the business, so we release our ships and licenses to local fishers who are prepared to do business our way. The word spreads. Everybody wants in. We organize the fishing group into a lobbying group. We change the California law, and the end of the story is this is one fishing community that can now confidently expect to fish in this place for generations. So the moral of this story here, it's kind of obvious, right? Build alliances, get to know one another, listen, show respect, etc. I don't want to go on and on because I want time for questions. I think I'll jump to one last story. Now fast forward to my era at TNC. Things are getting harder, unfortunately. And the thing that is most different about today than 15, 20 years ago is we're all smart enough to know now that we really have to address climate change. Climate change is by far the toughest issue we have to address and the most urgent one. It's tough because nature's pretty darn resilient, and so you can really let things screw up in many, many cases and then organize a comeback for nature in really pretty compressed periods of time. I grew up in Cleveland. When I was a kid, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. All the trees and gardens that my immigrant grandparents planted died, and if you were to return to Cleveland today, the lake's in pretty good shape, the sky is blue, stuff is growing again. Nature's pretty darn resilient. But those local victories don't apply to climate change. To do this, to address climate change, we've got to get most of humankind on the same page. It's hard, too, because in Cleveland we had dirty air and a river on fire and dying fruit. That really captured people's attention. Greenhouse gases are invisible. The change is a little bit distant. And, of course, to address climate change, it requires kind of, at least in the short term, really wrenching decisions in how our economies are organized. So really hard. You guys all know that. And then we think about the U.S. We say, gosh, at TNC we're thinking, doesn't the U.S. need to be a leader here? And then here we are. We're a nonpartisan organization. We're organized state by state. Prior to 5 years ago even, TNC ducked a little bit on the contentious political issues associated with climate change. We are great champions of forests and protecting forests because they not only harbor biodiversity, but they sequester carbon. And we were great champions of using nature to adapt to climate change, coastal ecosystems to deal with storms and sea level rise. But when it came time to public policy in the U.S., we ducked a little bit, especially in red states or in places where it was difficult to talk about climate change, because there was a nervousness about upsetting this great bipartisan 50-state friends on both sides of the aisle stature that we had. But we flipped that around. I'm really proud we did. And we said, no, since we do have that state-by-state, nonpartisan standing, friends in both parties, friends in every state, friends on both sides of the aisle in Congress, we ought to be a leader in the climate policy front. So for the only time in TNC's history, and maybe it'll be the only time we ever do this, we imposed on our U.S. chapters a requirement that each state needed an explicit climate change strategy. And they had to talk about it. There was no bearing about it because we want to develop a 50-state coalition for smart climate policy. So you can imagine how this was received. We have a big annual meeting every year with all these trustees, and so there they all are, several hundred of them, and I'm in the room, and we have blue state trustees who are saying, Mark, even the word you're using, that's like too wimpy. We should be much, much, much more aggressive on the climate change front, you fool. Don't you pay attention to the science? And in the other half of the room, we have red state trustees, proud Republicans, many of whom come from states where these are tough issues, both for social reasons and because fossil fuel energy is a big part of the local economy. And also, nobody likes being told what to do, and they're like really angry. And then I probably screwed up a little bit too, and maybe others did, but by inadvertently saying a thing or two that made people think I was being partisan or whatever. It's hard not to do that these days, but I try. And so a number of trustees from, again, mostly red states, I'm not picking on them. They had every right to say, look, these are really tough issues where we live, and they are. And we don't like you telling us what to do. And if you really mean business, Mark, if you stick with this, we're going to quit. In fact, our whole chapters might succeed. And I said, although our bylaws don't really allow for them succeeding, but the trustees could quit. So I had to go around and speak with these trustees who were really angry with me. And it's really been an interesting experience for you. By the way, the punchline is the 50-state program is going well. And it gives me a lot of optimism that we are going to be able to work our way up from this divide we're in today. I'll come back to that. But just on the spirit of mindfulness, respectfulness, listening, that kind of thing, I had no choice. I had to go out to these different red states and meet with these angry trustees, hear where they were coming from, see whether we could create some peace out of all this, etc. And it's been an enormously positive experience for me and for TNC. But a couple of observations. First of all, most people don't do that. Virginia might be a little bit different, but most parts of the country, again, red state, blue state divide, I know is a little bit too simplistic. Sometimes it's an urban-rural divide. There are lots of ways to do this, but most people today are mostly hanging out with and talking with people and working with people who think the way they do. By the way, it's true for me too, and it would probably still be true even this very moment, except that my job required me to go see these trustees. And then every time I did this, the same kind of thing happened. I got a little better at it because I was getting practice each time. But the trustees would be angry with me for a bunch of reasons. First of all, I probably did say something not quite right to kind of piss them off. Second, they didn't like being told what to do. Third, they had real reservations or doubts about climate change, and I probably would too if I had their circumstances, lived where they did what they did. And so they'd come kind of all fired up, wanting to have a fight. And when I wasn't at my best, I'd fight right back. And you can imagine how those meetings went, not very well. But in most cases, and we had a lot in common that we could draw on. Obviously, we were all parts of the big TNC family. In most cases, instead, we stayed calm. We listened to one another. We looked for areas where we might have some agreement. We built a little bit of momentum there, gained more confidence and trust in one another, then turned our attention to the areas where we disagreed. I would always note, can't we be aware of our disagreement and be open to closing the gaps and making some progress? And that's what we've been doing across our whole organization. And I would say that's going very well. So why does that matter? Back to the themes of my speech. In order to make that work, you've got to do your very best to resist fighting, resist dividing us and them, resist blaming. All that stuff gets in the way. Instead, honestly, openly trying to understand one another, find areas of common interest, build from there. Exactly the kind of thing that I think is happening not nearly enough these days. But I'm proud that TNC is in a position to try to scale that stuff kind of up. So anyway, these are the kinds of things I have in mind. I don't know if you find them persuasive or if I pick the best examples, but these are the kinds of things that I have in mind when I think about what I need to do or the frame of mind I need to be in these circumstances or the folks I'm working with. For me, they're the kinds of practices that arise from practices of mindfulness or contemplation. Let me wrap up. I have some notes because I want to hear from you, and I welcome any challenges on any of this stuff. I'm not pounding the table and I'm saying right, but I did try to draw some lessons. So first lesson, to do this stuff, which I'm describing, is hard. It's really, really hard. Maybe I'm making it sound easy, right, when I rattle these things off, but it's the opposite of easy. It blows my mind how divisive and polarized the world is and our country is today. And to make any progress here, if you seek to make progress on these fronts, you've got to calm down and just be less reactive and do these things like listening and showing respect and finding common ground. All easy to say, but not that easy to do in tough, contentious situations, sometimes where people are really on the attack. So how do you quiet your mind down? One way, I think, is meditation or mindfulness, and that's what's helped me. But I don't mean to suggest that's the only way. I notice that many church-going people get those same qualities from going to church, engaging in church activities, prayer. Other people I notice, many of TNC's volunteer leaders who are really good, they get that just from a life devoted to service. So there's probably numerous ways one can get that, but I really do believe slowing down the mind is step number one. Step number two, I don't know if I've spoken about this today explicitly, but I think about it all the time. There's a lot of bad stuff going on right now. And so I don't mean to suggest for a minute you should be a wimp or you should bite your tongue or push to the side the truth. We can't do that. So the way I think about it, and it again comes from the world of religion, hate the sin, not the sinner. So we work with a lot of big companies. The companies we work with, our critics love to bring to our attention all the things these companies have done bad over the years, and they're absolutely right. In my early days, we had a big partnership with Dow Chemical, which we were super transparent about. That was a smart way to do it, but it was controversial. Controversies died down because we did good work together. But people would say to me, Mark, why would you ever work with Dow Chemical? Look at their environmental footprint. And I would say, exactly, that's why I would work with Dow Chemical. If we can shift their behavior even a few degrees, the difference can be very big. But anyway, I think this notion of hate the sin, not the sinner is important. Next, look for common ground. I think this is a big deal. I tried to convey this when I told you this history of TNC. In these divisive or tribal times, everyone, not everyone, but many people, I think, especially in the face of pushback or contention or seeing something that really upsets them, there's so much pressure to blame the other side and to retreat into the group you're more comfortable with. I think that can be a big mistake. And that's why I think TNC's history is so interesting to me and revealing. If you can just decisively try to get past that, doesn't mean you're going to bury the differences. You have to deal with them, but you don't have to start with that. You can start where you have common ground and then deal with the tougher issues. I think that's important. I'm almost done here, too. Don't be too sure of yourself. This is a mistake I think many environmentalists make, including my colleagues, and I'm sure I make the same kind of mistake. We get so wed to a particular strategy, and we care so much. We have so much passion. We become we have blinders on. And I think it's really silly in the environmental field, and especially silly when we think about a big challenge like climate change. How could anyone be so foolish to think they know exactly what the right strategy will be? We have so far to go, and we've seen every strategy struggle. We've got to be more open to different approaches. And then I have too many of these. I'll stop. The last one, I'll sort of start where I started in my lessons. This stuff is hard to do. And so it's a long game. Although we're in a hurry, and we should be, we also have to be a little bit patient. And again, I think that quiet and calmer mind can allow for that. So those are my thoughts. Personally, I've benefited as a beginner from my practice of meditation. I told you why I don't hold myself as an expert there. I do believe, though, TNC has demonstrated for the things that we want to do, the respectfulness, the listening, that the openness to working with diverse groups. These are practices that really can unlock tremendous progress. And I think we've proven that in the environmental field. I hope we'll prove that even more going forward. And I even hypothesize it would work in other social sectors where we have a lot of important work to get done. Thank you very much. Okay, with that, I welcome any challenges, questions, observations. That's what we can do, right, David? And then when we run out of time, these guys will let us know. And we have people with mics. Yes, ma'am. Here comes somebody with a mic.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed your stories and your comments. I guess what I'm wondering with the Nature Conservancy, if your trustees and your members in all these states are part of the Nature Conservancy, then obviously they care about the environment. And we've been kind of led to believe that anyone who's red doesn't care about the environment, or if you're Republican, you don't. And I found myself being that way, which is so silly and not true. So I'm wondering how you train your employees to go into situations and take what you have learned through meditation, being open, being a listener, to go to these states and realize that almost every state is like a person, and they need to tell their story. And if the majority of their jobs come from fossil fuels, how could we possibly expect them to just completely change their business for the good of the environment? There's just, they need to be looked at as an individual. I'm just wondering how you train your employees for that.
It's a very eloquently stated question. I think you're right about folks in all parts of the U.S., but all around the world. I haven't met many people who are against nature or against protecting the environment, which is kind of a good place to start. But anyway, how does TNC do this? So TNC was already on kind of onto this before I showed up. I've learned from my peers. But again, because we began as a very pragmatic organization wanting to get very concrete things done, that was part of the TNC culture, if you will. But I would say that culture and that way of doing things is under pressure right now because it's hard. And again, you read all about this every day, and you're aware of all the social media stuff, and you're all aware of how politics happens, and it's not just in the U.S. I'm always on the road, and the kind of political challenges we face in the U.S. now are very, very common all over the world. So it's harder than it used to be, I would say. So we have to be even more determined to do this. And so one thing I would observe at TNC, it's kind of good, is we don't make, individuals don't make big decisions all by themselves. We like to talk about it. So what often happens in our shop is somebody or other, and sometimes it's me, gets all worked up about some particular issue. And by the way, we're not wrong to get worked up. There's bad stuff going on out there. But our team is pretty good at helping us calm one another down, and then because we want to think really hard about, okay, what will be the most useful thing to do? So usually the most useful thing to do is to not get really angry and have vituperative criticisms of people, but rather to think really carefully about the strategy we're going to choose. We choose a lot of strategies that lots of people don't like. That's fine. When they don't like our strategy, again, we don't want to be, and they might say some mean things about us when we explain our strategy. You want to resist taking it personally. It's not personal anyway. And listen to people. And by the way, we make mistakes, so we like hearing from our critics. But I think the moral, or the big thing is you want to stay calm, hear people, stick to the truth. That's why we rely so much on our science. Not back down from what the science tells us. Not attack others. Hate the sin, not the sinner. All this stuff. It sounds kind of corny, I know. Or it might sound like vague. We draw on our culture. We have different kinds of training to reinforce that stuff. This 50-state climate work is really hard, but there we have a living laboratory. We've got 50 different units, and although the states are all very unique, there's usually some state that's pretty much like any other state, a couple of them, so they can learn from one another. We share those best practices. And then on the topic of mindfulness, my wife and I are small donors to TNC, and so we've contributed some funding for mindfulness training. It's definitely optional. We'd never impose it. But then being geeks, we paid close attention to how it was received and how the recipients say it's benefited them, and it's benefited them a lot. But again, there are different ways to use my parlance, quiet the mind. But we're on all of that. Sometimes then people hear this or they watch us in action and say, oh, no, you guys, you're too quick to collaborate. You're too quick to compromise. You're sellouts, or they say even meaner things than that. I always say to my team, we want to listen to our critics. Our critics are our friends. Sometimes we wish they would be more polite, but we don't take it personally because sometimes we might make a mistake and partner with the wrong organization. We might partner with them for very good reasons, but then they'll disappoint us. So as we speak, we're rethinking some big partnerships. But as a good partner, I'm not going to name them right now. So it's all very dynamic. It's a moving target. Nothing's etched in stone. And we never claim we're right about anything. The world's more complex than that. So those are some reactions. What else? Yes, sir.
Mike, I think you're totally on the right path of trying to align mindfulness. And I would encourage you to even go deeper and to think about happiness, the roots of what happiness really is. I think that one of the ills that we have in this country is the notion of the pursuit of happiness. When the great thinkers, the great minds of the world would say, our innate state is happiness. And what we call unhappiness is the veil of separation that comes over each of us in our naturally happy state. And you, as a leader of the largest ecological group, I think can pull nature into a realm of healing in a way that moves us from what is really the opposite of happiness, which is separation, and brings nature into healing, as a way of bringing us back to wholeness.
Well, it's a great observation. In a meeting right before this session with a bunch of the UVA faculty, we talked about that a little bit. Gretchen Daly, a really famous scientist on our board, at Stanford, has brought to my attention all this brilliant work scientists are doing, I'm sure, including at UVA, really taking this notion that nature is I wrote a book about nature being an extraordinary investment opportunity, this asset that can do so much good for us. Well, among the things it can do good for us is it can improve our health. It can help our kids score higher in SATs. It can make you happier. Florence Williams, a friend of mine, has written a good book about this called The Nature Fix. So I agree with that. And most people in the environmental movement kind of know that at their core. That's part of what got them involved in the environmental field in the first place. Another thing I'll note, this is a little bit of a digression from your comment, but part of my job is just to spend time with the supporters of TNC, our great volunteer leaders. And so in this role, I've gotten to know a lot of elderly people and soon-to-be elderly people. I was talking about this with the faculty, too. And so, and I'm getting elderly myself, or close. But anyway, I never knew that many older people until I got this job. And so you get to know old people, including very old people, and I've gotten to know a lot of really, really happy, very old people. And so my wife and I sometimes, she goes to a lot of events with me, which is nice of her. So we'll often be at social events, and we'll be going home afterwards, and we'll observe the people who seem most youthful, most engaged, were really the eldest people at the party. And why is that? Well, what they mostly have in common is, in our case, they've devoted themselves to a cause. In our case, it's protecting nature. And so right off the bat, they're thinking less about themselves and all the things that people get hung up on, and rather trying to make the world a better place and caring about vulnerable people. For me, these are qualities that mindfulness develops. But if you need a rationale for supporting the Nature Conservancy, it can be the secret of a long, happy life. Yes, right behind you. You guys can ask tough questions, too. Usually, if I speak at a university, that happens.
Well, luckily, I have a tough question.
There we go.
I'm a global development studies major, and we often talk about how capitalism has deep roots in exploitation, sexism, classism, and racism. And are there alternate routes to go along that are not capitalism, or do you think we have to continue with the system that we've been going on? We often talk of other systems. We're not sure what they are, but can we truly be sustainable and resilient if we keep moving along these lines of capitalism?
It's a really good question. I mean, can capitalism work better? I guess you're saying it's done so many things. It's done some things pretty well, but it's done so many things so poorly. I do think about this. I mean, I got to be a little bit careful. As the head of TNC, who am I to speak about capitalism? But I worked for 24 years at Goldman Sachs. I devoted a large part of my life to capitalism. So my own 2 cents on capitalism is that it's in a kind of broken state right now. First, it's done a lot of bad things in the past, but we might be letting that happen again. So even though the U.S. economy is booming today, my goodness, we have all this inequality. We have all these really bad environmental outcomes, and they're on the rise. And we have all these other bad social sector outcomes. And my argument to leaders of capitalism, well, actually all around the world, but I'll just stay in the U.S. right now, is, there are 2 ways capitalism can be fixed. Capitalists can try to self-improve fast, or it'll be fixed for you in ways you might regret. And leading capitalists are paying attention to that. Larry Fink has recently become a board member at TNC, and he's a friend of mine, so I won't pretend to be perfectly objective, but he runs BlackRock, the biggest money manager in the world, and he's making waves because he's challenging all the companies they invest in to be clearer about what is their purpose and how do their range of activities align with that. He gets a lot of critics, too. Whenever you do something like along these lines, you get a lot of criticism, which is good. I think Larry, too, says, hey, his critics are his friends. They're helping them do their job better. But my own personal point of view is we need to fix capitalism. We shouldn't give up capitalism. But, who says I'm right? I mentioned in the earlier meeting, Naomi Klein. I mean, I pay close attention to Naomi Klein. She sometimes is a really vicious critic of Big Green, she calls it, and TNC and me. But she's not stupid. She says, hey, capitalism doesn't work. It's behind everything that's wrong in the world. So capitalism needs to be brought to an end. Economic growth needs to cease in the developed world. There can be a little bit more in the developing world, but that's all. And in response to that, I say, look, I'm in the environmental business, not the revolution business. I don't see any appetite for that. And when I'm in the developing world, I was in Colombia. Well, Colombia is, I guess, a middle-income country. I was there. I just got back yesterday. Colombia, I mean, what an interesting country. Smart, good leaders. They understand our environmental issues well. Their ecosystems are generally in great shape, in part because of, sadly, the trouble they've had with guerrillas for the last several decades, which prevented economic exploitation of big ecosystems. Those troubles aren't over, but they've been mitigated. And so now that government seeks, and business leaders, and community leaders, and indigenous people, they all, to me, seem to be some degree on the same page. Lots of disagreement about the details, but they want economic growth. They really want it because they want to lift people out of poverty. There are a lot of very poor people there. But they also want to protect their ecosystems because, first of all, they love nature for nature's sake in a way that I think is better than on average in America. They also understand those ecosystems are an economic asset. And then the balance of this is tricky. It's easy to see how it will spin out of control, and the outcomes will be bad, social outcomes, as well, political outcomes, environmental outcomes. But they also see a better pathway, and so balancing that's generally where TNC is engaged. So that's our approach. So we're one of those groups, and I'm one of those people. But we recognize that there are other people with a completely different point of view, and we pay attention to that too. And we'll see who's right. Again, I'm not pounding the table saying our way is the only way. I think, though, it's the most likely way to achieve our environmental goals in the near term. Right before I was in Colombia, I was in China. Hard to think of a more controversial place on environmental issues. But it is a country led by older people, mostly men. They've all been trained in science and engineering. They would laugh you out of the room if you suggested anything that looked like climate change denialism. They think America is crazy right now to be conceding the environmental global leadership spot to them and the green renewable energy spot to them. President Xi, again, controversial person, I'm fully aware of all the pros and cons there, but he speaks openly about, he doesn't have that many goals, just a couple, and I think there are 3 or so. One of them is to build an ecological civilization in China. Their model of political organization is not ours, but their business model and economic model is increasingly like ours. So, we just have to see how this stuff all sorts itself out. You'll have plenty to do in the years ahead after your time here. What else? Yes? Maybe you can introduce yourself. I should have mentioned that earlier. Okay. Where's the mic? Where's it going? Here, a guy? I pointed to this guy here. There he is. But who am I to say? Does someone have the mic right now? Go ahead. We can go there and then over there. Sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't see you.
This is kind of
we'll wrap up I think we have to wrap up soon.
This is kind of a follow-up to your talk about capitalism and money issues. I saw a documentary recently about Holland, a country that's basically underwater, which is what they're predicting for islands and Miami and Vienna and some of these places. What do you see? Your title of your talk has the future in it. Could we make the massive investments that Holland has made to keep themselves from going totally underwater? Do you really think that's going to happen? Right now, people are so busy lining their pockets with our tax cuts, et cetera, et cetera. It's mind-boggling to think of what massive investment it's going to take.
Yeah, this is an area of high priority for the Nature Conservancy because we see enormous. Well, you don't have to look into the future anymore. We're facing the real-time consequences of climate change right now, as measured by these extraordinary storms and fires and sea level rise, et cetera. And we happen to believe, and it's one of the things I wrote about in my book, that nature itself can be one of the great investment opportunities to build the resilience we need. Coastal ecosystems to deal with sea level rise, green infrastructure in cities to deal with water management issues, et cetera. So we're in that game in a big way. The near-term problem for rich countries is, and especially here in America, I'm afraid, is we don't make investments in any infrastructure right now. I mean, it's, to me, colossally stupid. But sooner or later we will, and I think green infrastructure will get its fair share of the investment opportunity. And I'm not that nervous. I'm presuming the Miamis and New York Cities of the world will be smart enough to protect themselves. Inevitably, we're doing it too late, so it will be far more expensive, and there'll be much more harm than should otherwise have happened. But I expect we'll be rich enough to do this. But I think we've got to worry a lot about less well-off, less wealthy places, vulnerable people, low-lying island countries. They're extraordinarily in harm's way. I mean, it's just an extremely sad thing. And then you see today a little bit of migration pressure leads to such enormous political stress here in the U.S., in Europe, et cetera. Just wait for climate refugees. We can build walls, but you can't build walls big enough to stop, millions and millions of people. So it's sad. That's why in climate change there's so much urgency. The know-how is there to address these issues. The will to do so isn't there yet. And I do think we have to worry about the will to make the investments that will help more vulnerable people. It's extremely easy now to identify exactly who they are and where they live. The Paris Climate Accord was, I think, something all humans could be proud of. It was a first big step toward doing all of that. And, hopefully we can hang in there. But no, it's a worrisome. I mean, what more can I say? So anyhow, about all that, I say, well, I'm fortunate at least to have a job where I can go to work every day, roll up my sleeves, and try to do something about it. But one of my great friends and a former board member, Jeremy Grantham, brilliant investor, so he still writes these investment papers about the market like big investors do, but he mostly writes about climate change. But he says, this is the race of our lives, and will we not win? Before we wrap up, I want to ask that gentleman back there, because I had indicated him. And then, I don't know, David, are we supposed to end now, or can we go a little bit longer? Or, anybody who has to leave, just step up and go. You won't hurt my feelings. I know people are busy. Yes, sir.
Yes. So a lot of times meditation is associated with some sort of transcendent aspect. So the world looks a lot differently when you're some hairless ape walking around with a social security number and stresses and a bank account versus, being some like a universal consciousness or giving yourself to living some purpose or something like that. So I'm just curious if for you, that transcendent aspect of being something bigger than an individual has been a part of the benefits you've received, and if you think that's a key element to people adopting that vision or that mentality to bring about these large-scale global changes that we're kind of discussing here.
It's a good question. I tried to self-disclose this at the very beginning. I'm not really an expert in meditation. I consider myself a very, very humble beginner. I think it's helping me. I'm hanging in there. I'm reasonably dedicated, but I'm not able really to speak intelligently about transcendence and such things. I talked about some of the practical qualities, I think, or practices that arise from meditative practices. Another thing I think about, or sometimes challenged about, is that if meditation makes you more content, might that make you then disengaged and less inclined to take on these big issues? I don't think so at all, because I think at the same time it's making you kinder and more concerned about others. But I think it prevents you from freaking out. I think another part of our challenges with climate change is some people don't know enough, and they're kind of on purpose burying their head in the sand. So that's one problem. Other people know a lot and are completely freaked out and panicked. That's not so good either. And so I think a contemplative practice can make you calm and content in a way that you're not freaked out in a way. You're calm and resolute and even accepting about the big challenges, and then that puts you in a better position to be disciplined and action-oriented. We don't want people to be checked out, nor do we want them to be freaked out. We want their heads in the game, and I think contemplation can help that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Blair. Ooh, I'm loud enough without this mic. I work for a young, nonpartisan nonprofit that seeks to really change the way people see energy, about how they think about energy. And we try to lead with energy and not lead with climate. And right now we're reevaluating our programs, trying to really make them evidence-based. One of the things we've been looking at is new studies, in particular coming from the Center of Behavior Change, that it's much easier to take someone on a scale of 1 to 10 from a 7 to a 10 than a 4 to a 7. And given the urgency of this issue, the argument being, do we really have time to focus on people who have their heads in the sand or who aren't ready to hear this argument, who are the 2s and the 4s? Should we just be focusing on taking people from that 7 to 10? The flip side to that argument is, well, can we do this without everyone? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two arguments.
Yeah, great question. By the way, renewable energy, it's a pretty encouraging thing. So, humankind, society can come together and to do big things. I was still at Goldman Sachs. So late 2000, 2006, 7, 8, there was a lot of skepticism by really smart business leaders and investment leaders about whether solar and wind would ever make any progress. Almost no one predicted then where we would be today. And how did we do that? We had a lot of ingenuity from the business sector, et cetera. We had a lot of very favorable public policy, and that was put together in the face of a lot of political opposition. So we can do some tough things. And that also was an area where diverse groups came together. It's a really great example. But your specific question, who do we need? So people say that kind of about my 50-state climate thing. They say, oh, Mark, you're such a dreamer. You're so naive. What a Pollyanna. You'll never win over the far, far right who just are absolutely opposed to climate change. And I say, fine, we don't need them. In America, good news, you just need majority political coalitions. And I don't even think we're that far. So today, we're under no illusion that right this minute we're going to have federal climate policy. We need a little bit more change in our leadership in D.C. right now, but we might not be that far from that. So that's why, in the meantime, we're doing everything we can at the state level, especially, also at the city level, to build that coalition so that when an opportunity arises at the federal level, we'll be able to demonstrate real, broad, diverse, two-party support for this kind of stuff. And probably that will come from people in your parlance, the 6s and 7s today. There's all, by the way, even in this last election, there were a bunch of conservation ballot initiatives on the ballot. We won, the Royal We, the environmental movement, we won almost all of them. That was the same in the case when, at the time, Trump was elected. And when we do our polling, we see extraordinarily diverse support for everything TNC believes in. A challenge, though, is when you ask people to rank the issues they care about, environmental ones tend to score too low. So we have to somehow or other prioritize, our issues. But, look, other issues are important too. Okay, we better wrap. I think you guys are too polite to step up and go. But one last question, or okay, then I'm just going to say again, thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate it.